She was left in the rain to die, until the cowboy lifted her and said, "I promised your mama." The scream came first, thin and small, swallowed by thunder. He almost rode past it, almost convinced himself it was just the wind playing tricks through the canyon walls, the way it did when storms rolled down from the mountains and turned the whole desert into something living and angry. But then he heard it again, a child's cry, raw and broken, the kind of sound that cuts straight through a man's chest and finds whatever piece of his heart still knows how to bleed. The cowboy pulled his horse to a stop and listened. Rain hammered against his hat, ran cold rivers down his neck and back. His hands were numb on the reins. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, heading nowhere in particular, the way he always did when the ghosts got too loud. But now the storm had brought him something worse than memory. It brought him a choice. He dismounted slow, boots sinking into mud thick as guilt. The child was lying near the riverbank, half covered in wet leaves and broken branches, her little body curled tight like she was trying to disappear into the earth itself. She couldn't have been more than 3 years old. Maybe 4. Her dress was torn, soaked through, clinging to her like a second skin. Her hair was plastered to her face in dark, tangled strings. And she was alone. The cowboy dropped to his knees beside her, his breath catching hard in his throat. For a moment, just one terrible, frozen moment, he didn't see this child at all. He saw another face. A woman's face, pale and smoke-stained, her eyes wide with fear and something worse than fear. Trust. She trusted him, believed him when he said he'd come back for her and the boy, believed him when he promised. But he hadn't come back. He'd ridden away, instead, told himself it was safer that way, that the men hunting him would burn everything they touched if he stayed. And maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. All he knew for certain was that when he finally did return, there was nothing left but ashes and 2 graves some kind stranger had dug beneath a cottonwood tree. The little girl in the mud opened her eyes. They were brown, deep and wet and full of the kind of terror no child should ever have to carry. She looked at him like she expected him to hurt her. Like every person she'd ever known had taught her that pain was all the world had left to give. "Hey now," he whispered, his voice rough and low. "Hey now, little one. I ain't gonna hurt you." She didn't believe him. He could see it in the way her body went stiff, in the way her hands clutched at nothing. But she was too cold, too tired, too broken to run. So she just lay there, shaking, her lips turning blue beneath the rain. The cowboy pulled off his coat, heavy and worn, but still warm from his own body heat, and wrapped it around her like a blanket. She was so small inside it, so impossibly small. He gathered her up into his arms, held her close against his chest, and felt her heart beating fast and frightened like a trapped bird. "I got you," he said. "I got you now." And then, without meaning to, without even thinking about it, he said the words that had haunted him for 5 long years. "I promised your mama." The child didn't understand. How could she? She didn't know him. Didn't know the woman whose face he still saw every time he closed his eyes. Didn't know the promise he'd made and broken, the lives he'd failed to save, the weight he carried in his chest that felt heavier than any gun he'd ever worn. But saying it out loud, even to a stranger, even to a child who had no idea what it meant, felt like lancing a wound that had festered too long in the dark. He carried her to his horse, a sturdy roan mare who stood patient in the rain, and lifted the girl up into the saddle. She whimpered, but didn't fight, didn't scream, just sat there, shivering, staring down at him with those wide, haunted eyes. "Where's your people?" he asked gently, looking around at the empty prairie, the storm-darkened sky, the river running high and fast with runoff. "Where'd they go?" She didn't answer. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she was too young to have the words. Or maybe, and this thought settled cold and heavy in his gut, maybe there was nobody left to go back to. The cowboy swung up behind her, pulled her back against him so she wouldn't fall, and wrapped one arm around her middle. She was still shaking, still silent. But after a moment, she leaned into him, just a little, like she was testing whether it was safe to stop fighting. He turned the horse north, toward the nearest town. It was a 2-hour ride in good weather. In this storm, it might take twice that. But he didn't have a choice. The child needed shelter, food, warmth, and he needed answers. As they rode through the rain, the cowboy found himself talking to her. Soft and low, the way you might talk to a spooked animal. He told her his name was Caleb. Told her he was a drifter, a ranch hand when the work was there, a cowboy when it wasn't. Told her she was safe now, that he wasn't going to let anything happen to her. He didn't tell her about the woman, about the burning cabin, about the little boy who died because Caleb had been too much of a coward to stay and fight. But he thought about it. Lord, he thought about it. The girl's shivering started to ease as his body heat soaked into her. Her breathing slowed. After a while, she turned her face into his chest and closed her eyes, too exhausted to stay afraid anymore. And Caleb felt something crack open inside him, something he'd kept locked and buried for so long he'd almost forgotten it was there. It felt like grief. It felt like hope. It felt like a second chance he didn't deserve but couldn't turn away from. By the time they reached the edge of town, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle. The child was asleep in his arms, her small fingers curled tight around the fabric of his shirt. Caleb looked down at her, at this tiny, broken thing the storm had brought him, and made a choice. He wouldn't ride away this time. River. He said it out loud for the first time on the third morning, when she finally looked at him without flinching. They were sitting on the porch of the boarding house where he'd rented a room, watching the sun climb slow and gold over the prairie. She was wrapped in a blanket that was too big for her, eating bread and butter he'd bought from the general store. Her hands were still small and careful, like she expected someone to take the food away. "That's your name now," Caleb said quietly. "River. You like that?" She didn't answer. She was too young for words, or maybe the words had been scared right out of her. But she looked at him, and something in her eyes seemed less afraid than before, less hollow. So he took that as close to yes as he was going to get. He named her River because that's where he found her. Not because it meant something beautiful or hopeful. Not because he thought it would give her a fresh start. He named her River because every time he said it, he remembered the rain and the mud and the choice he'd made to stop running. And he needed to remember. Needed the weight of it. The town didn't understand. Within a week, the whispers started. He heard them in the saloon when he went to ask about work. Heard them at the mercantile when he bought her a dress that actually fit. Heard them on the street corners when he walked past with River's hand tucked small and trusting in his own. "That drifter's gone soft," they said. "Cowboy like him's got no business raising a child. He'll abandon her soon as the wind changes. Men like that always do." The sheriff, a tired-looking man with gray in his beard and suspicion in his eyes, pulled Caleb aside one afternoon outside the livery stable. "You her father?" the sheriff asked, arms crossed. "No, sir," Caleb said. He didn't lie. Never saw the point in it. "Her kin?" "No, sir." "Then what exactly are you doing with her?" Caleb met the sheriff's gaze and held it steady, keeping a promise. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, like he was trying to read something written in a language he didn't quite speak. Finally, he nodded once. "You hurt that child, drifter, and I'll put a bullet in you myself. Don't care what promise you think you're keeping." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "I'd expect nothing less." He found work at a ranch just outside of town. Hard work. Honest work. Breaking horses, mending fences, moving cattle from one pasture to another under skies so wide and blue they made a man feel small. The rancher was a decent sort, asked few questions, paid fair wages, and didn't seem to care that Caleb brought River with him most days. She'd sit on the fence rail and watch him work, her little legs swinging, her eyes tracking his every movement like she was afraid he might disappear if she looked away too long. And maybe she was right to worry. Men like him had a way of disappearing. It was what they did best. But he didn't disappear. Instead, he built something that almost looked like a life. He rented a small cabin at the edge of town, just one room, with a stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed they shared because there wasn't money for more. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And every night, After River had eaten her supper and washed her face in the basin, Caleb would sit by her bedside and carve. He carved horses. Small wooden ones, no bigger than his palm. He'd started carving them years ago, back when there was a little boy who used to follow him around a homestead, begging for stories about outlaws and gunfights and wild mustangs that couldn't be tamed. Caleb had made that boy a horse, painted it brown and black, gave it a mane he'd carved strand by careful strand. The boy had loved it. The boy had died holding it. Now Caleb made them for River, one each week. He didn't talk while he carved. Just sat there in the lamplight, his knife moving slow and steady, shaving away thin curls of wood until something living emerged from what had been nothing. River would watch him with those big brown eyes, her thumb in her mouth, her breathing soft and even. She didn't know what the horses meant. Didn't know she was a replacement for all the people he'd failed. Didn't know that every time he looked at her, he saw the woman in the burning cabin and the little boy in the cottonwood grave and every other soul he'd left behind because leaving was easier than staying. All she knew was that his hands, calloused and scarred and rough from years of hard living, were gentle when they touched her. That his voice was steady when he read her stories from a battered book of fairy tales he'd bought at the mercantile. That he never raised his hand to her, never shouted, never looked at her with anything but a quiet, aching sort of care that felt like safety. And slowly, so slowly he almost didn't notice it happening, she began to heal. She started talking. Just a few words at first. Caleb. Horse. More. Then sentences. Small ones. Can I come? Is it morning? Will you stay? That last one hit him hardest. Will you stay? She asked it one night when he was tucking the blanket around her shoulders, and the question hung in the air between them like smoke. He looked down at her, at this tiny, fragile thing the world had tried to break, and felt something twist hard his chest. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. I'll stay. Promise. The word was a knife. He'd made promises before. Promises he'd broken. Promises that had cost people their lives. And here was this child, asking him to make another one, trusting him with a faith he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. But he couldn't say no, couldn't walk away. Not again. I promise, he whispered. She smiled then. A real smile. The first he'd ever seen on her face. And she closed her eyes and fell asleep holding the wooden horse he'd just finished carving. Her small fingers wrapped tight around it like it was the most precious thing in the world. Caleb sat there for a long time after, watching her breathe, watching the lamplight flicker across her peaceful face. The town thought he'd gone soft, thought a drifter like him had no business playing father to an orphan child. And maybe they were right. But for the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel like he was running. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, even if it scared him more than any gunfight ever had. The rain came back on a Tuesday. Caleb was sitting on the porch, watching River play in the yard with the wooden horses he'd carved for her over the years. She was 8 now, tall for her age. Her hair had grown long and dark, and she wore it in 2 braids the way he taught her. She was laughing, a sound that still caught him off guard sometimes, still felt like a miracle he didn't deserve. Then he saw the woman. She was standing at the edge of town, just past the mercantile, soaked through from the rain that had started falling an hour before. Her dress was plain and worn. Her face was thin, drawn tight with something that looked like hope and terror mixed together. And her eyes were scanning every corner, every doorway, every face, like she was searching for something she'd lost and thought she'd never find again. Caleb's heart stopped. He knew. Before she moved. Before she spoke. Before anything happened at all. He knew. The woman started walking toward them. Slow at first, then faster, her boots splashing through puddles, her hands trembling at her sides. And when she got close enough to see River clearly, close enough to see her face, her features, the shape of her mouth and the color of her eyes, she stopped. Her knees gave out. She dropped right there in the mud, her hands covering her face, her whole body shaking with sobs so deep and broken they seemed to come from somewhere older than grief itself. River looked up from her horses, confused. She glanced at Caleb, then back at the woman. her small face full of questions she didn't know how to ask. "Caleb," she said softly. "Who is that?" He couldn't answer. His throat had closed up tight, and his hands were gripping the edge of the porch rail so hard his knuckles had gone white. He wanted to stand, wanted to move, wanted to do something, anything, to stop what was about to happen. But he couldn't, because he'd known this day would come. Had known it from the very beginning, from the moment he'd lifted River out of the mud and made a promise he had no right to make. Had known that somewhere, somehow, there might be someone looking for her. Someone who had a better claim to her than a broken-down cowboy, with too many ghosts and not enough hope. The woman looked up, tears streaming down her face, and whispered one word. "Sarah." River froze. It wasn't her name. Hadn't been her name for 5 years. But something in the way the woman said it, something in the sound of it, the shape of it, made River go still and silent, like a part of her buried deep down remembered something she couldn't quite reach. "Sarah," the woman said again, louder now, standing on shaking legs. "Sarah, baby, it's me. It's Mama." The word hit Caleb like a bullet. "Mama." River took a step back, her eyes wide and frightened. She looked at Caleb again, and this time there was something desperate in her gaze. Something that said, "Please don't let this be real. Please tell me this isn't happening." But he couldn't tell her that. Because it was real. It was happening. The woman came closer, moving slow now, like she was afraid of scaring River away. "I know you don't remember me," she said, her voice breaking. "I know it's been so long. But baby, I've been looking for you every day since I had to leave you by that river. Every single day." "You left her?" Caleb's voice came out rough, harder than he meant it to. He stepped down off the porch, putting himself between the woman and River. "You left a 3-year-old child alone in the mud during a storm?" The woman flinched, but she didn't look away. "I didn't have a choice," she said. "Her father, my husband, he was a violent man. An outlaw. He would have killed us both if he'd found us together. So I hid her. Left her where I knew someone would find her. Where she'd be safe. Safe." Caleb's hands were shaking now. "She could have died out there." "I know," the woman whispered, and the pain in her voice was so raw it made him take a step back. "I know. But if I'd kept her with me, she would have died for certain. He was hunting us. Tracking us. I had to make him think she was already gone. Had to make him stop looking." "And did he?" Caleb asked. "Stop looking." The woman nodded slowly. "He's dead now. Killed in a shootout with a sheriff 2 counties over. It took me 3 years to find that out. And then it took me 2 more to track down every town, every river, every place I thought someone might have found a little girl." She looked past Caleb then, her eyes finding River, and her face crumpled with fresh tears. "I never stopped looking, Sarah. I never stopped. I had to keep you alive. Even if it meant losing you." River was crying now too, though Caleb didn't think she fully understood why. She was pressing herself against his leg, her small hands gripping his coat, and he could feel her whole body trembling. "Her name is River," Caleb said quietly. "That's what I call her. That's who she's been." The woman nodded, wiping her eyes. "River," she repeated softly, like she was testing the weight of it. "That's a good name. A strong name." She looked up at Caleb, and for the first time, there was something like gratitude in her gaze. "You took care of her. All this time. You kept her safe when I couldn't." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. Didn't know how to explain that River had saved him just as much as he'd saved her. That she'd given him a reason to stop running. A reason to stay. A reason to be something more than the sum of his failures. "She's a good kid," he said finally. It was all he could manage. The woman took another step forward, then knelt down so she was eye level with River. "I don't expect you to remember me, baby," she said gently. "And I don't expect you to come with me right now. But I'm your mama, and I love you. I've always loved you, even when I had to let you go." River looked up at Caleb, her eyes full of questions and confusion and fear. "Caleb," she whispered, "is she telling the truth?" He wanted to say no. Wanted to tell River that this woman was a stranger, that she had no right to come back after all this time, that the life they'd built together was real and permanent and couldn't be taken away. But he couldn't lie to her. Not about this. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think she is." And something inside him broke clean in two. The woman didn't leave. That was the first shock. Caleb had expected her to take River's hand and walk away into the rain, taking with her every piece of the life he'd built over 5 years. He'd braced himself for it, had already started building walls around the hole it would leave in his chest. But instead, she looked at him and said, "Can we talk? All three of us. Inside, out of the rain." So they sat at his small kitchen table. Him, River, and the woman who said her name was Margaret. River stayed close to Caleb, her chair pulled right up next to his, her hand wrapped tight around his arm like she was afraid one of them might disappear if she let go. Margaret sat across from him, her hands folded on the table, her eyes red from crying, but steady now. She looked at River for a long moment, drinking in every detail like she was memorizing a face she'd seen only in dreams for too many years. "I need to know," Margaret said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "I need to know what happened. How you found her. How she's been. Everything." Caleb didn't want to tell her. Didn't want to open up the locked places inside him where he kept the things that hurt too much to touch. But River was looking up at him now, waiting, and he realized she needed to hear this too. Needed to understand why he'd carried her out of that storm. Why he'd stayed when every instinct he had screamed at him to run. So he told them. He told them about the woman in the burning cabin. About how he'd been a drifter back then, a ranch hand moving from town to town, never staying long enough to put down roots. How he'd stopped at a homestead one winter, looking for work, and met a widow and her young son. How they'd taken him in, fed him, trusted him. Her name was Elizabeth, Caleb said, his voice rough. And her boy was called James. He was 6 years old. Smart as a whip. Used to follow me around asking 100 questions a day. Margaret listened without interrupting, her face soft with something like understanding. "There were men after me," Caleb continued. "Outlaws I'd crossed paths with in another territory. I didn't think they'd track me that far, but I was wrong. They came one night while I was in town, getting supplies. Set fire to the cabin. Elizabeth and James were inside." River's grip on his arm tightened. "Elizabeth got James out," Caleb said, "but she was hurt bad. Burned. She knew she wasn't going to make it. And she looked at me and said, 'Take care of him. Promise me you'll take care of my boy.'" He stopped, his throat closing up. The memory was as sharp as broken glass, cutting him from the inside. "And I promised," he whispered. "I looked her in the eyes and I promised." "But you didn't," Margaret said gently. "It wasn't a question." Caleb shook his head. "I tried. For a week, I tried. But those men were still hunting me, and I knew if I stayed, they'd come back. They'd kill James just to hurt me. So I took him to the next town over. Left him with the preacher and his wife. Good people. People who could keep him safe." "That sounds like you kept your promise," Margaret said. "No." Caleb's voice cracked. "I told myself that's what I was doing. But the truth is I was scared. Scared of staying. Scared of being responsible for another person's life when everything I touched seemed to turn to ash. So I rode away. And 2 months later, I got word that James had gotten sick. Fever took him in 3 days. The preacher said he kept asking for me. Kept asking when I was coming back. The silence that followed was heavy as stone. River was crying now, tears running quiet down her cheeks. But she didn't let go of Caleb's arm. "So when I heard that cry in the storm," Caleb said, looking at Margaret now, "when I found River lying there in the mud, alone and cold and so small, I thought maybe God was giving me another chance. A chance to keep the promise I broke. To do it right this time." "You did," Margaret whispered. "You did do it right." Caleb shook his head. "She's not mine to keep. She's yours. I was just holding her until you could come back." But Margaret reached across the table then and took his weathered, work-worn hand in both of hers. Her touch was warm and gentle, and when she spoke, her voice was full of a grace he didn't know how to accept. You didn't break your promise to Elizabeth, she said. You kept it. Just not for the person you thought you were keeping it for. You kept it for my daughter. For Sarah. For River. You became the father she needed when I couldn't be there. And that matters, Caleb. That counts. He wanted to argue. Wanted to tell her that it wasn't the same, that he'd failed, that he didn't deserve her kindness or her forgiveness. But the words wouldn't come. They were stuck somewhere behind the tears he was trying hard not to shed. Margaret looked at River then, at this little girl who'd grown up with a cowboy's love and a cowboy's steady hands, and she smiled through her own tears. I'm not here to take her away from you, Margaret said. I'm here to thank you, and to ask if maybe there's room in her life for both of us. River's head snapped up. You mean? I can stay with Caleb. Margaret nodded. If that's what you want, baby. If that's where you feel safe. But you're my mama, River said, her voice small and confused. I am, Margaret said, and I always will be. But he's your father too, in the ways that matter most. And I think maybe we can figure this out together. All three of us. Caleb looked at Margaret, then at River, and felt something in his chest break open. Not with pain this time, but with something bigger. Something that felt like hope and healing and second chances all wrapped together. Are you sure? He asked Margaret. She smiled, and it was sad and beautiful, and full of the kind of strength that comes from surviving things that should have broken you. I spent 5 years running from a violent man and searching for my daughter, she said. I'm not going to tear her away from the only home she's known, the only father she's had. That's not love. That's just more pain. So they made a new kind of family. One that didn't fit any pattern the town had seen before, but worked anyway because it was built on truth and sacrifice and the understanding that love isn't about ownership. It's about showing up and staying, even when it's hard. River called Margaret Mama and Caleb Pa, and neither of them corrected her. Margaret found work at the dress shop in town and took a room at the boarding house, but she came to the cabin every evening for supper. And slowly, over weeks and months, the three of them learned how to be together. On quiet evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the rain fall soft and clean across the prairie, washing the dust from the air and the guilt from Caleb's weary heart. River would sit between them, holding a wooden horse in one hand and her mother's hand in the other, and Caleb would look out at the wide, open sky and think about promises. The ones he'd broken, the ones he'd kept, and the one he was keeping still every single day, with every choice to stay.